judge to be the national interest, Mr. Speaker. So, with Mr. Speaker, with permission, I beg to move the motion standing in my name under the Fixed Term Parliament Act. Last Wednesday, the Right Honourable Member for Islington North became the first leader of the opposition in the history of our country to show his confidence in Her Majesty's government by declining the opportunity to have an election with a view to removing the government. Though when he spoke last week, it seemed that he might recover his nerve tonight, and I wait to see how he responds. Referring to his surrender bill, he said, and I quote, last week, "Let this bill pass and gain royal assent, and then," he said, "we will back an election." Well, the surrender bill, the Surrender Act has now passed. It has gained royal assent. He has done his level best to wreck this country's chances of a successful negotiation. By his own logic, he must now back an election. And so, Mr. Speaker, I am retabling the motion for an early date general election. I don't want an election. I hope this step would be unnecessary. Yet I have accepted the reality that an election is the only way to break the deadlock in the House and to serve the national interest by giving whoever is Prime Minister the strongest possible mandate to negotiate for our country at next month's European Council. Labour, too, have accepted this reality in their own leaflets this weekend. This weekend, they say, we need a general election now. We need a general election now. That's what it says. And yet, throughout the weekend, the right honourable gentleman's cronies, together with those of other opposition parties, have been trying to disguise their preposterous cowardice by coming up with ever more outrageous excuses for delaying an election until the end of October or perhaps November, or when hell freezes over, in the dither, delay and procrastination that has become the hallmark of the opposition. Why are they conniving to delay Brexit in defiance of the referendum, costing the country an extra £250 million a week for the privilege, £250 million a week for the privilege of delay, enough to upgrade more than 5 hospitals and train 4,000 new nurses? The only possible explanation is that they fear that we will win it, Mr. Speaker, that I will win it, and secure a renewed mandate to take this country out of the EU, a policy they now oppose. And that is the sorry tale of this opposition in this Parliament. For the last 3 years, they have schemed to overturn the verdict of the British people, delivered in a referendum, which, in a crowning irony, almost all of them voted to hold. In fact, Mr. Speaker, they didn't just vote to hold it. Some of them even... I'll give way with pleasure to the Honourable Lady.
Thank you for the Prime Minister for giving me way. I'm really pleased that he's chosen to give me an intervention. But he's here reading off the fact that the amount of money that is being spent going into Europe could pay for nurses and could upgrade our hospitals. But may I say, 9 years of austerity has led to our NHS being fragmented. 9 years of austerity has led to our education services being failed. 9 years of austerity has led to 4 million children living in poverty. So all you need to do, Prime Minister, is move forward, because we will call an election when it is time.
Well, if that's what she thinks, why doesn't she have a word with her right honourable friend in front of her and tell him to reverse his absurd policy of spending an extra £1 billion a month to keep us in the EU, and we're spending £1 billion on 20,000 more police officers on the streets of this country, Mr. Speaker. But some of them, the Liberal Democrats, also called for a referendum on our membership of the EU, And once they got it, and by the way, they lost that referendum, of course, they did nothing but try to overturn the result, arrogating to themselves the authority to decide which democratic elections they respect and which they reject. Now, Mr. Speaker, where are they, the Liberal Democrats? There they are. They want a second referendum, but they're already planning to campaign against the result. When asked whether she would implement Brexit if the people voted for it a second time, the party's new leader replied no. So every time the Liberal Democrats lose a referendum, they just call for a new one over and over again. And I must say, it turns out that the honourable member for Dunbartonshire East is as it were, the new leader of the referendum party, the Jimmy Goldsmith of our times. But they are models of coherence by comparison, Mr. Speaker, with the leader of the opposition. His strategy, mysterious as it is that by some process he becomes Prime Minister, but he went without an election, since he's against elections. He then goes to Brussels and negotiates a new deal, presumably keeping us in the customs union and in the single market. He then comes back and passes that deal through the House, then takes it to the country in a second referendum, whereupon he campaigns against his own deal and that's the plan, isn't it? But perhaps you clarify, and urges the nation to reject his own handiwork. Mr. Speaker, we know the real reason why Labour don't want a general election. We know why they don't want a general election under his leadership. Most of them don't want a general election because they fear that their party will lose. But there is a small, terrified minority of Labour MPs who don't want an election because they actually think he might win, ladies and gentlemen. And as for the Scottish Nationalist Party, the SNP, last week the First Minister for Scotland correctly said, and I quote, "It's starting to feel like Labour doesn't want an election at all." She then issued a clarion call to her own assembled armies in Westminster to, and I quote, "force an election." And what are they doing? How do those brave stalwarts of Scottish separatism propose to force that election? By heroically abstaining. And the common thread joining all these parties is that there is their extraordinary belief that the national interest requires them preemptively to protect the British people from the consequences of their own democratic decisions. The truth is, Mr. Speaker, they only believe in democracy when it delivers the results that they want. Her Majesty's loyal opposition have a constitutional duty, Mr. Speaker.
Noise in the chamber. The decibel level needs to reduce. The Prime Minister shouldn't have to shout in order to make himself heard, and the same will apply when the Leader of the Opposition gets to his feet. The Prime Minister.
I'm grateful. Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Her Majesty's. Well, they say they can't hear. How's that? How's that? Mr. Speaker, Her Majesty's loyal opposition have a constitutional duty. There they are. They have a constitutional duty to oppose the government and to seek to replace it. For this task, Mr. Speaker, they are handsomely paid. They are handsomely paid to the tune of almost £10 million of taxpayers' money. They are. That's what they're paid to do by the taxpayer, the leader of the opposition himself.
Point of order, Anna Soubry.
Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, the microphone being placed so close to the Prime Minister means he can't hear that some of us over here are trying to intervene and have something that he and his backbenchers don't want, which is a debate because we all want to know whether he'll abide by the law that this Parliament has passed.
Yes, I say as much for the benefit of the watching public as for anybody else. That is an example of what I call the norm. Superficially a point of order, but entirely bogus. The Honourable Lady's made her own point in her own way with suitable alacrity, and it's on the record. The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, may I thank you on your characteristically impartial judgments. The leader of the opposition. The leader of the opposition, there he sits. His party paid £10 million by the taxpayer. The leader of the opposition himself is entitled to over £140,000 of taxpayers' money. And yet today we have the extraordinary spectacle of the entire opposition collectively deciding to abrogate their most fundamental responsibility. Mr. Speaker, they have their job. They know what they should be doing. In this era of creative litigation, are there not grounds for legal challenge to compel them to do it? The leader of the opposition, honourable members can have their say in a minute. Mr. Speaker, I'm concluding my remarks. Sometimes he says we should leave the EU. Sometimes he says we should have another referendum. Sometimes he says we should negotiate a new deal. Sometimes he says he would accept whatever Brussels offers. Over the past few days, the Labour Party has said that it wants to delay Brexit, then negotiate a new deal, then have another referendum, then campaign against their own deal in that referendum. Perhaps their next policy will be to have a referendum on whether to have a referendum. Mr. Speaker, the leader of the opposition cannot lead, he cannot make a decision. He cannot work out whether he is for Brexit or against it, for a referendum or against it. The only options he likes are dither and delay. And I say to the opposition benches...
Order! I'm immensely grateful to the Prime Minister for his ready compliance with the procedures of the House. A point of order from Mr. David Linden, which I hope... Order, Mr. Swire, I don't require any assistance from you. You wouldn't have the foggiest idea where to start. What I'm seeking to establish is whether it is a point of order. When I've heard it, I will know. Until I have, I can't. Mr. David Linden.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, people observing tonight's proceedings will see that the annunciator shows that this is the second time that this House has been asked to approve this motion. Given that the Prime Minister is displaying somewhat of a contradiction by saying that he wants to ask this question of the House again, but not allow the people of Scotland an independence referendum, can you outline, Mr. Speaker, is this hypocrisy on the part of the Prime Minister?
Well, an ingenious effort, but let me just say to the Honourable Gentleman, this motion wouldn't be on the paper unless it was orderly. And I'm happy to conduct a seminar for the Honourable Gentleman's benefit outside the Chamber at a later date. It is at this time, given the context, orderly. He's made his own point, but it's a different one and it doesn't meet the needs of the case. The Prime Minister.
So thank you, Mr. Speaker. And so I say again to everybody on the opposition benches, if you really want to delay Brexit beyond October the 31st, which is what you seem to want to do, then vote for an election and let the people decide. Let the people decide if they want to delay or not. And if you refuse to do that tonight, then I will go to Brussels. Our government will go to Brussels on October the 17th and negotiate our departure on the 31st of October. Hopefully with a deal, Mr. Speaker, but without one if necessary. I will not ask for another delay. I will not ask to delay.
Order. I apologise for having to interrupt the Prime Minister. Look, I will take these points of order, but I hope that they're genuine. Order. I hope that they're genuine. And the Prime Minister will then proceed with his speech. Point of order, Patricia Gibson.
Mr. Speaker, I am keen to have your guidance, given that we are supposed to be debating whether or not to have an early general election, whether the Prime Minister in that context is willing to share with the House whether or not he is willing to obey the law of the land.
Yes, that's a political observation, not a matter for procedural adjudication by the Chair. Dr Sarah Wollaston, point of order.
Speaker, I have a point of order on behalf of the Liaison Committee, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister gave an undertaking that he would appear before the Liaison Committee this Wednesday at 3:30. The Liaison Committee have met today and we have read to the Prime Minister to ask whether he will still appear because...
Order. What I would say to the Honourable Lady, I recognise the sincerity and the strength of conviction. If she wishes to contribute to the debate in an orderly way, on her feet, in a speech, because she catches my eye, she can, but she shouldn't use the device of a bogus point of order. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I repeat my point.
Point of order, Geraint Davis.
The Prime Minister has just informed the House that on the 31st of October he'll go to Brussels and ensure that we leave with or without a deal in contravention of the motion that we've just passed, that we will obey the law in compliance with the law that's just been passed. Is that out of order?
I'd be immensely grateful if the honourable gentleman didn't feel it necessary to keep pointing at me. I know he feels strongly, but it isn't a point of order. And I would say, in terms of the seamlessness of these proceedings, come on, let's have fair play. The Prime Minister is entitled to make a speech and be heard, as will the Leader of the Opposition be. The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for allowing me to repeat my salient point that I will not ask for another delay. The people of this country have had enough of the delectable... The people of this country, Mr. Speaker, have had enough of the delectable disputation.
Order. This is profoundly disorderly. Members mustn't be shouted down in the chamber. They mustn't be shouted down in the chamber. There are standards to be upheld, and they must be. The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it is plain from the turbulent reaction of the benches opposite that they simply want another delay. And I will not have that. The public have had enough of the delectable disputations of this House, and I must warn members that their behaviour in thwarting the will of the people is undermining respect for this House in the country. Mr. Speaker, if honourable members want another delay, the only proper way to do it is to ask permission from our masters, the people, from our masters, the voters, and I commend this motion to the House.
The question is that there shall be an early parliamentary general election. I call the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The only point of any importance that the Prime Minister has just included in his speech is his clear indication that he does not intend to follow the law that has just been passed that requires him to ask for an extension under certain circumstances. He also, Mr Speaker, gave no answer to the two decisions this House has already made today concerning the publication of Yellowhammer documents and his own behaviour as Prime Minister in respect of laws agreed by this House. Because the Prime Minister has failingly seemed to grasp that opposition benches have actually been very clear that the House, Mr Speaker, has expressed its will until the Act has been complied with and no deal has been taken off the table. No deal taken off the table. We will not vote to support the dissolution of this House and a general election. Now, I want an election, Mr Speaker, as the Prime Minister pointed out. And the Conservative Party has very generously broadcast footage of me and my friends saying that we want an election. I don't retreat from that at all. We're eager for an election. But as keen as we are not prepared to risk inflicting the disaster of no deal on us, our communities, our jobs, our services, or indeed our rights. Mr Speaker, no deal would not be a clean break. It would not mean just getting on with it. It would start a whole new period of confusion and delay. But this time, Mr. Speaker, set against a backdrop of rising unemployment, further deindustrialisation and of deepening poverty all across this country.
Order. I said a moment ago the Prime Minister should not be shouted down. Let me say to people who are shouting their heads off, it will be readily obvious to people observing our proceedings that's exactly what they're trying to do, including some extraordinarily stupid and noisy yelling from people secreting themselves behind the chair and thinking they're being clever. It's very low grade, it's very down market, it's very substandard, it's very boring, it's very predictable, and if the whips operated any sort of discipline, they would tell those people to try to get a life. The Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the point I was making was that it will be in a backdrop of unemployment increasing, deindustrialisation and deepening poverty within our society. Not very surprising that the government was so keen to hide the Yellowhammer documents, their own documents, which would demonstrate this to be the case. We have no faith that the government is seeking a deal in good faith. Indeed, the former Work and Pensions Secretary said in her resignation letter, I no longer believe leaving with a deal is the government's main objective. EU leaders have received no proposals. Government ministers have offered no explanation of the deal they are seeking, even if there is such a deal they're seeking, let alone any worked-out proposals presented to Parliament for scrutiny. No wonder they're so keen to prorogue so early to avoid any scrutiny of what they're doing. The only conclusion, Mr. Speaker, the only conclusion that can be reached, and it is backed up by all the leaked reports in the press, is that the government's pretensions to negotiate are nothing but a sham. The Prime Minister knows full well there is no mandate for no deal, no majority support for it in the country and no majority support for it in this House. But he refuses to rule it out and refuses to set out any proposals to avoid it. Mr. Speaker, this is a very serious issue. The Prime Minister is running away from scrutiny, running away from scrutiny with his blather and his shouting. Many people, Mr. Speaker, including the member for Hastings and Rye, are in conclusion that no deal is his only answer. But he has no mandate for that, and the last general election gave no mandate for no deal. The 2016 referendum gives no mandate for that. And, Mr. Speaker, the co-convener of the Vote Leave campaign said in March this year, and I quote, "We didn't vote to leave without a deal." He is now the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. No deal is opposed by every business group, every industry group, every trade union, and has been opposed in votes in this House. I want to turf out this reckless government. This government that is driving up poverty, deepening inequality, scapegoating migrants, whipping up divisions and failing this country. A general election isn't something for the Prime Minister to play about with for propaganda points or even his very poor quality posts on social media. So perhaps the Prime Minister can, which could be the last time in this session of Parliament, answer some questions. Firstly,
Order, Mr. Philp. You're very loud and rancorous. Calm down, young man. You're getting very overexcited. Very, very overexcited. Very overexcited. Very overexcited. You can do a lot better than that. You must try to do so. Jeremy Corbyn. We're great.
Questions, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, to the Prime Minister, where are his proposals for renegotiations? Where are they? When were they published? What is their content? Secondly, since if he seeks a no deal, why doesn't he argue for it and seek the mandate for it that it so far does not possess? There is not a mandate for no deal. No, I'm not giving way. Thirdly, if as he claims, he is making progress,
Mr. Speaker, if the right honourable gentleman really wishes to avoid a no-deal Brexit, can he explain why he is unwilling to call an election, go to Brussels and seek to...
Order! Mr. Doherty Hughes, calm yourself. Is the Prime Minister Is the Prime Minister satisfied that he's made his intervention, or does he wish to complete it?
Complete it? Yes. Well, I'd like to know, Mr. Speaker, if the honourable gentleman wishes to avoid a no-deal Brexit, why does he not call an election, get a mandate, go to Brussels and negotiate a deal himself? What's his objection to that?
Because, Mr. Speaker, we're the responsible party in this room. We don't want to crash out with no deal. And there is also, Mr. Speaker, the issue, of course, of trust in a Prime Minister who is unable to answer any questions and is desperate to suspend Parliament to avoid any scrutiny. Thirdly, Mr. Speaker, if he is making progress, as he told the House last week, why did the Taoiseach tell the Prime Minister only this morning he was yet to receive realistic, legally binding and workable plans? That was only this morning. The Prime Minister must be able to remember it. Perhaps he could explain why the Taoiseach felt the need to say that. I realise the desperation of the Tory party when all they can do is rearrange the mics on the Titanic. And finally, since Mr. Speaker, he didn't bother to turn up for the... Mr. Speaker, if I could just inform, with great respect, the members opposite, I've no intention of giving way to any of them, OK? And finally, Mr. Speaker, since the Prime Minister didn't bother to turn up for the previous debate, will he respect the law and implement the EU Withdrawal No. 6 Act if he has negotiated an agreement backed by this House on the 19th of October? This Parliament is not a platform for the Prime Minister's games. No, it's a chamber in which the elected representatives of the people hold the executive to account. That is what parliamentary democracy is about. The Prime Minister has been asked 4 simple questions. simple questions. Mr. Speaker, I'm not giving way.
Order. Mr. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is talking up no deal to one wing of his party and talking up getting a deal to another wing of his party. The sad reality is he's not preparing adequately for the first and not negotiating at all for the other. On Sunday, Mr. Speaker, the 15th, it's UN International Day of Democracy, when the UN celebrates governments being held accountable to their national parliaments in a democracy. This government is only interested in shutting down Parliament to avoid any scrutiny. His obfuscations and evasions are being rumbled, both at home and abroad, and that is why he doesn't answer questions. And he's so keen to avoid any scrutiny. Tonight, he will be attempting to prorogue Parliament for one of the longest prorogations there have ever been, shutting down Parliament, shutting down democracy, avoiding questions, taking this country over a cliff of a no-deal exit, with all the damage that will do to many of the poorest and most vulnerable communities in our society, and all the damage it will do to trade and jobs, all because he wants to take this country into the direction of a trade deal solely with the USA rather than anybody else. Mr. Speaker, we are not walking into traps laid by this Prime Minister.
Mr. Jeremy Lefroy.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to be extremely brief. And that is simply, and if I could ask the Right Honourable Member who will be concluding on behalf of the Government, just one or two questions. If we do vote for a general election tonight, it will mean that we enter into new types of rules. There will be purdah, there will be other things, there will be rules upon the civil servants. What I would like to know, because I've heard from his very lips, the Prime Minister's strong contention that he is in favour of a deal, is negotiating hard for a deal, and I absolutely believe him in this. What I would like to hear from the government is how this can be pursued and prosecuted in the course of a general election, in which I believe also that the opposition would have to some extent be at least kept informed. That is all I want to ask, because I think it's a very important point at a time during a general election when everybody is so consumed with campaigning, quite rightly. How are we going to be able to prosecute these negotiations and also deal with the matters of keeping everybody, including the Leader of the Opposition, informed?
Thank you. Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say it's a pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman from Stafford, and let me commend him for the way that he has behaved with dignity in his intervention tonight. Can I say to the House, this is an absolutely crucial time for all of us. It's an absolutely crucial time for all our constituents. Of course, there are strong opinions, and there should be. Of course, we should have robust debate. Frankly, Mr. Speaker, I am utterly appalled and ashamed at what we've witnessed in this House this evening. And, you know, I can see members laughing, but all of us have a sense of responsibility. And remember this, we had the death of an MP a few short years ago. Too many members in this House are receiving death threats. Too many members of this House are getting verbal abuse outside this place. The leadership that we show, how we all conduct ourselves in this place, is very important. And I appeal to everybody to show restraint, to act in a dignified manner, and to show respect to each other. We owe that to all our constituents. I will give way to.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way, and I do believe he says what he says with total sincerity. And in that spirit, was he ashamed that a member from his benches, when the Prime Minister was on his feet, shouted out the words, "You're a liar"? And another member from the Labour benches shouted at the Prime Minister, "You're a thug." Does he agree that those things bring the House into disrepute?
Mr. Speaker, I'm appealing to all members to behave in a way which is respectful to colleagues and respectful to our constituents. You know, I have to say I listened very carefully to what the Prime Minister said. I will not ask for another extension. I will not ask for another extension. Mr. Speaker, just dwell on these words. Because the Prime Minister is saying with those words that he's going to ignore an Act of Parliament, that he is going to ignore the law. And I would simply say to the Prime Minister, be careful. Be careful. You occupy the highest office in the land. And what you're demonstrating to the people of the United Kingdom is that the law doesn't matter. That's a very serious situation to be in. And I ask the Prime Minister to think again, to think very carefully, or be prepared to pay the consequences of ignoring the law of this land.
Would he give way on this point, briefly? Because doesn't he agree with me that if this was the head of government in a country, say Georgia or Moldova or in Latin America, Tory MPs would be lining up to pontificate about that country being a failed state. But because a union flag has been wrapped around it with the usual Tory jingoism, they think it's all A-OK.
Well, look, I am deeply concerned about what is happening, and I'm deeply concerned about the proroguing of Parliament and the fact that the government has pushed through this proroguing of Parliament on the votes of 3 members of the Privy Council, against the express wishes of the majority members of this House. That does concern me, and as Democrats it should concern us all. Mr. Speaker, I said last week, and I'll say it again, the SNP wants a general election. We want the opportunity to bring this government down, and we're going to take it. We want the opportunity for the people of Scotland to have their voices heard, to make their choice over their futures. And, Mr. Speaker, we want the opportunity to stop this Prime Minister from ripping us out of the European Union against our will. Can I say to the honourable gentleman...
Order! The right honourable gentleman shouldn't have to do so. You are a most statuesque figure, Mr. Kaczynski, and therefore you're very readily visible and sometimes audible. I very gently say to you, because you're generally a very good-natured fellow, that it is quite inappropriate when standing at the bar of the House also to be bellowing. Stand and look impressive rather than yell, man. That would be my advice. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We want the opportunity to stop this Prime Minister from ripping us out of the European Union against our will. Members can jeer all they want, but this Prime Minister has lost Scotland.
Hear, hear.
The Prime Minister has lost the support of the old Scottish Tory leader.
Yeah.
Writing tonight in the Evening Standard, Ruth Davidson has landed a blow on the Prime Minister. Things are really that bad for the Prime Minister and for this shambolic failing Tory government. Mr. Speaker, the matter is simple. We want an election, but we don't want it on the Prime Minister's terms. This is a Prime Minister obsessed with running down the clock, a Prime Minister who cannot be trusted, a Prime Minister who is seeking to trap Parliament tonight so he can drive us off the cliff edge. Well, Mr. Speaker, we are not falling for it.
Hear, hear.
The Prime Minister thinks he can treat Parliament however he wants. He thinks he can ignore the people of Scotland, to treat our Scottish Parliament, our government and our citizens as second-class citizens. Mr. Speaker, Scotland will not be ignored. Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain in the European Union. Scotland voted overwhelmingly for the SNP to oppose the Tory government here in Westminster, and Scotland will have the chance to vote to say that this Prime Minister, this government, does not represent the people of Scotland and our wishes. Mr. Speaker, since the referendum, we have been treated with contempt, shouted down, our voices silent, our interests sidelined. Well, Mr. Speaker, let me put the Prime Minister on notice. The election is coming. I give way.
The right honourable friend for giving way, but the fact he fails to tell the House, and I've said it before, in 2016 there was more people in Scotland voted to leave the European Union than voted for the SNP in the 2017 election.
Well, you can ask for more, and I can see the Prime Minister laughing. But let me tell you what happened in 2016. We had election to the Scottish Parliament, and the SNP won its third election on the trot. And we did that with a manifesto commitment that if there was a material change in circumstances, then the Scottish people had a right to have a referendum for their future. So my message to the honourable member from Ayr, to the Prime Minister, respect the will of the people of Scotland. Mr. Speaker, once the threat of a no-deal Brexit is removed from the table, the SNP will act, and we urge others to act, to bring down the Tories, oust this Prime Minister and let the people have their say. Once we're safe in the knowledge that we're not leaving the European Union on Halloween, the days of this government will be over. When we return in October, we expect the opposition to work together to bring this government to an end. We've had enough of this dictatorship, enough of the deceit, the fake news, the sham fighting, the games and the stunts. We've had enough. So I say to members, I say to people at home, across these islands who are feeling lost, forgotten, anxious and worried about the future, our time is coming. We will keep fighting for you. Where we can, we will work in the interests of the people across Scotland and the UK to protect our economy from the Brexit catastrophe. And we will create the circumstances, find a way to strip this government of power, end the democratic... Can I say to the honourable gentleman, if you wish to speak in the debate, you might try and attract the eye of the Speaker. Shouting out like this, shutting down Scottish voices is not the way to go. Mr. Speaker, end the democratic deficit and give the people back control. An election is coming, and the SNP will assure that post the suspension period, when no deal is off the table, that the people of Scotland will have the opportunity to choose their future, to choose to be citizens who want to be part of Europe, to choose to live in a country that is outward-looking and welcoming, to choose to live in an independent Scotland focused on opportunity and fairness, free of broken Brexit Britain. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is warned. His days in office are numbered.
5,000. Sir Alan Duncan.
Mr. Speaker, I had no intention a few moments ago of speaking in this debate, but I would just like to say three things which I hope the House will take on board. The first is to appreciate the constitutional catastrophic significance of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. I tried in a 10-minute rule bill to repeal it in 2015, and we all understand why it came into being. It was to be the glue in the coalition government after the election of 2010. But it should have had a sunset clause. And the effect of this act is now to trammel this government and our Prime Minister in a very, very Kafkaesque trap, that he's finding it very difficult to govern, but is unable to call a general election. And I very much hope that the first act, probably of the next Parliament, will be to abolish the Fixed-Term Parliaments Act. The second point is this. It's just to issue a word of caution about the danger that comes with mixing up the difficult and complicated, unresolved issue of Brexit with a potential general election. A general election is, by its very nature, general. We are all up for grabs. And all policies in a manifesto are also there for debate. But this has been, Brexit, the most divisive, poisonous, difficult issue of our life. And if we go into a general election with an unresolved Brexit, there is no way that a clear answer on Brexit can be said to emerge from that process. And quite possibly, because of the nature of Brexit and the way that it is pushing our entire post-Victorian party system into near collapse, and we may have four-way competitions in almost every constituency, we may find that it doesn't actually resolve the problem of government either. So I would ask this House to appreciate that we are in a dreadful bind, and that the binary politics of largely Labour and Conservative may be behind us, if not forever, at least for a very, very long time. And the third point is this. I've told my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, that despite some of our past differences, although we work together very closely in the Foreign Office, I will stick by the government. But I very much regret, and it's very painful, that 21 of the most decent members of Parliament, who I very much regard as kindred spirits, have lost the whip. And I would just ask the House to sort of imagine the scene. A slightly grotty Victorian building that passes as the headquarters of the local Conservative Association. Portraits on the wall of Disraeli, Churchill, Thatcher. Then perhaps a couple of blank spaces. And the chairman is there and the phone rings. And someone says, look, I'm a bloke from number 10, you've never heard of me, but I'm afraid your MP has been sacked. You must strike him off all the records, or her. You cannot talk to them now, and we're going to re-select someone straight away. The only response a self-respecting chair can give is, can I thank you very much for your call, young man. Now bugger off. So we must appreciate that still the constituency is an essential unit of our democracy. It is the building block which makes this House what it is. And there may, of course, be party rules, but we should be very careful about letting party rules be superseded by the control at the centre. So I very much hope that although many of the 21 will be standing down and it matters less to them, it is not the case for some whose career should rightfully be ahead of them. So I very much hope that my right honourable friend and our party system, through our chairman, can appreciate that a route should be found back for those who wish to stand again, and that all immediate selections for an alternative candidate should be suspended so that it can be known that they have a chance. So, no, I'm not going to wait to anybody. So, Mr. Speaker, no. So, Mr. Speaker, those are the 3 points that I simply want to make. And I hope that as this House goes through what is a very difficult and painful process as we approach the election, that when it is recomposed after that election, we can appreciate the importance of legislation in this House and pay it proper attention so that members of Parliament can see that making law is probably their most important role as members of Parliament, and that political combat should take a second place. And if we do that, we then, I hope, will never again have the folly of the Fixed-Term Parliament Act.
Oh, very well. Point of order, Mr. Paul Scully.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I fear that my right honourable friend might have inadvertently misled the House in terms of the fact that actually every single member of this party that has lost the whip is still a member of the Conservative Party, unless they have chosen to cross the floor. And so the situation that he's described is not actually the case. And actually, I think it's important. So therefore, it's important to actually realise that the discussion that we're having is that we need to be in the place that we should be talking about. Well done.
I don't wish to be unkind to the honourable gentleman because I recognise that he feels that he's got a serious point. But it's not a matter for the chair, and the right honourable gentleman member for Rutland and Melton has, if I may say so, made a speech whose meaning is perfectly clear. So if the honourable gentleman wants to disagree with him, he can do so elsewhere. But it's not a matter that requires my adjudication. I was absolutely clear what the right honourable gentleman was saying, and I don't think the House feels misled, if I may very politely say so. Jay Swinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it is a delight to follow the right honourable member for Rutland and Melton, who I think made a thoughtful contribution to this debate in what is an important time for Parliament, and may I say in some stark contrast to the beginning of this debate, which I'm afraid I do not believe was a very edifying spectacle for our constituents who are watching this and who are, many of them, worried about what is happening in our country right now. The braying, the bluster, Britain deserves better. I also want to commend the Right Honourable Member for Hastings and Rye for the brave decision that she took at the weekend. We are in exceptional times, and in the face of a Prime Minister who is prepared not only to shut out of his party more than 20 individuals who have given it great service, he is prepared to shut down Parliament, potentially flout the rule of law, and inflict on the British public the consequences of no deal as outlined in the Yellowhammer report. I think it is time that others in the Conservative Party also examine their consciences about what they can do and the role that they are playing in all of this. The Prime Minister, in his speech, goaded those of us on the opposition benches who disagree with his dash for an election, and he said it is because we are afraid that he will win. Well, I'd say to the Prime Minister, people in this country are afraid. They are afraid of a no-deal Brexit. They are afraid of a no-deal Brexit that his own government analysis, that he is trying to keep secret even in the face of this House voting for it to be published, says that there will be food shortages of fresh food and prices will rise, that there will be delays and disruption to fuel supplies in the southeast, and that there will be severe extended delays for medical supplies. So it is no wonder that people are afraid, and he should treat this matter with more seriousness.
Would she give way?
I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
Would she agree with me that instead of the government spending £100 million of taxpayers' money on propaganda, they should disclose the Yellowhammer and spend £100 million promulgating that to educate the public about the horror that faces us if we have a no deal?
Well, it's very clear that the government should release that report, and they have been instructed to do so by this House. I want to scotch the myth that he is putting about that a no-deal Brexit is in some way an end to this whole Brexit issue. As indeed Leo Varadkar made clear today, that would be a case of being back to the negotiating table, that a no-deal Brexit is just the beginning of many further years of negotiations. If people really want an end to this Brexit mire, the way to do that is to stop Brexit. I'll give way.
The Guardian, of which I'm an avid reader, says that the Lib Dems are poised to back revoking of Article 50 entirely. Is that correct?
I mean, the honourable gentleman cannot be surprised that the Liberal Democrats are a party that wishes to stop Brexit. And in a general election where we will stand to secure a Liberal Democrat majority, such a Liberal Democrat majority government would indeed revoke Article 50. I do not think he should be surprised by that position. Perhaps he should pay more attention. But this government and this Prime Minister have no mandate for a no-deal Brexit that they are trying to force on the British people. It is clear also from the resignations of the right honourable members, both for Orpington and Hastings and Rye, that he has no plans for securing a Brexit deal. He is not entering into this in any spirit of seriousness, and I think that the speech by the honourable member for Stafford made this point exceptionally well. Because how does the Prime Minister seriously think that with the previous occupant of that role having tried to negotiate a deal over the course of 3 years, that he and he alone can achieve in 4 weeks what she failed to do, and he can fight a general election at the same time? What arrogance! If he were serious about